Golyakov, Sergey. Hi, everyone. Since 2013, I'm informational security. I've been working in energy sector and banks. Right now, I work in insurance. I worked in fintech, author of tips in Avast. Today, we're going to speak about how we were able, with small team of OPSECs and DevSecOps, to implement the process of safe development. And we'll look at an example of SAST. We are going to speak about how were we able to implement this process in such a way so that teams would be interested in removal of vulnerabilities while they wouldn't come to us with the questions of how to remove them, what is to be done. We see something has worked, or maybe this is an error. We don't understand. Something got triggered. Well, we're speaking about options of implementation which are available. We're going to speak about which steps are available for the assembly. How do we manage this assembly? Well, I hope you've read it. Introduction. Briefly, we are going to look at the process of what is pull request. Pull request is when a developer makes his own feature tree and applies changes. Upon the result of these changes, creates pull request to fix his own changes. In case if there are certain vulnerabilities available, then our validational assembly of SAST will not let these pull requests to pass. If there are certain vulnerabilities and we have accepted them or declined them, then developer can complete his pull request, and in case of availability of certain continuous integration assembly, he may continue the process of this pipeline. So what are the options of implementations have been looking in our company? We've been looking at three main options of implementations. When we don't block pull request, we don't block assembly. So the criminal can apply vulnerability, developer can apply vulnerability. Therefore, we can learn about them by doing the statistical code analysis, and then have weekly meetings, put objectives into a backlog, and then someday, sometime in the future, they will be fixed. There's a URL to the article on how this approach was utilized in one of the Russian companies and how they've done it during all this period of time. But it was not our path. We decided to use the path of blocking pull requests. We do not allow developer to bring vulnerability into the initial code, source code. And the way we see, we have a relational assembly, statistical code analysis is being conducted in our example. If there is one of the vulnerabilities of critical level is available that we have determined for the specific repository or specific tree of repository, we block the assembly. We block pull request, Option number 3, when we block the assembly. So we allow the developer to complete the merger of his trees with his vulnerability that he could apply. And upon the result of this merge, the assembly is being launched. Developer, at the same time, will not be able to assemble the application because in this assembly, we add a step of statistical code analysis, which checks the availability of vulnerabilities, and by this, we do block pull request. We block the assembly. Well, I would like to summarize. If nothing is being blocked, it happens that time to market is kept, but the backlog of objectives for the removal is kept. For us, our security people, this leads us to the situation that we have to work with these vulnerabilities, and there will be much more of them. But in the case, if we block pull request, we have the history of working with vulnerabilities in the comments to the pull request. We can come back, we can look at what was happening, how was it happening. And this is good that less vulnerabilities go to the assembly and to the final product. If we block the assembly, the merger, for the IT, it comes to a problem that developer needs to go to the validational merger assembly, do some additional steps, clicks, mouse, look through the logbook, read these logs. If you look at the raw log of SAST, the developer will have to understand it. We understand it's not really clear, it's not transparent, and this is one of the main reasons why developers may come to us with certain questions.
Для нас это, конечно же, сохранение истории в переписке именно в pull request, а не...
We keep the history in communications of pull request descriptions, not with AppSec and not in emails. Let's look at the example of the pull scheme. An example of searching for secrets. Well, it's going to be a brief because the scheme is very big. You have the time to make a picture of it.
На самом деле, статический анализ кода, если вы не просто, допустим...
Statical code analysis. If you are not simply have launched SAST and look at the result, this scheme looks very big. We do a lot of different checks, which are possible, and we have a lot of conditions involved in this scheme. Well, I can talk a lot about it. We can discuss about this topic. Well, if you want to learn more about it, you can read about it in our corporate blog in Harbor. Let's look briefly at what is networking scheme from the SAST point of view. Networking scheme looks the following way. The orange one, the orange rectangle is the depository of code. We have the agent of assembly, which takes the code. It's a blue rocket. For example, if a statical analyzer doesn't have its own backend, we launch it, assemble the report, and return the data to code repository. If the assembly agent launches a SAST which has certain backend, then we need to initiate cooperation with the server which manages SAST, and then it distributes scanning tasks for its worker agents where the logic is being executed. And I would like to add, I have added dust arrows. They are in parentheses because this is a check on a test server of how this vulnerability can be exploited. Additionally, I have shown the access to different packet manager in case if our SAST allows us to do the composite analysis, and you will find URLs to access to different package repositories for downloading and some feeds. Approximate list is provided. Validational assembly. Search for secrets looks much simpler. There is an assembly agent, collects the code, checks it, and returns the result back.
Перейдем к самому интересному, на самом деле.
Let's go to the most interesting part of it. What steps do we have in validational assembly?
Мы имеем следующие шаги.
We have the following steps. On the screenshot, you can see them. We have step number 1, getting configuration. On this step, honestly, we are checking whether our statistical analyzer of the code is in a servicing mode. What is it? Let's speak about it in the future. We have a step of pre-flight. What it says, pre-check of exception list.
Мы на этом шаге проверяем, надо ли сканировать.
On this step, we check whether there is a need of scanning of a certain repository or the branch of the code or all the repositories of this specific project in DevOps. In other words, we are checking whether we need to put all other checks and all other steps. Then we will check out the code. If our statical analyzer has its own health check, we can launch it and we are going to check that nothing is going to break. Then we can check connection to the server, SAST service, if it has its backend, and we don't have to send tasks for scanning, don't spend time on these.
Далее есть шаг сканирования. На этом шаге...
Then there's a scanning step. During this step, we are waiting for the result from server. SAST server, and on the basis of this result, on the step of the publication of this report, this result is being put into the assembly artifacts, and I will speak about it a little bit later. And on the stage of result processing, we are executing all our checks that we can invent, and the example of these checks, during search for secrets, you were able to see there was a big scheme. So in our case, if you can see it on this screenshot, it says that there are vulnerabilities of the medium level, I don't see it, which means that we have blocked pull requests due to this reason. Configuration files.
как я говорил,
We can manage, as I've told you, behavior of validational assembly, and we do it with the help of config
пример такого
files.
конфигурационного файла,
The example of such a config file,
так называемое всеми там любимое слово quality
this is
мы
so-called
можем
quality gate.
поведением SAST на уровне
We can match SAST behavior on the level of the branch repository project. In the given case, the branch is not provided. An example of the first parameter is responsible for whether one needs to block the validation assembly and prohibits to upload the code in case, well, in any case, irrespectively to those exceptions which are available afterwards.
строке 3 позволяет нам
The parameter in line 3 allows us to reflect by comments those vulnerabilities of that level of criticality
обязательны к
which we think mandatory for removal. Upon the results of finding even one vulnerability of this level, we are blocking pull request.
Есть параметр, который отвечает за
There is a parameter which is responsible for the level of vulnerability in a given case, low and below.
эти уязвимости отображаем pull request.
These vulnerabilities have to be by pull request, but we do not complete the pull request. Two parameters which are responsible for the necessity of adding security, application security engineers into checking the pull requests.
Просто за необходимость. Второй отвечает
One is responsible for the necessity, another is responsible whether these engineers will be added as mandatory approvals or non-mandatory approvals.
данный
There is a block exclusion rules. This block is necessary to do the post-check
уязвимостей, ну, например, наш
and post-processing of vulnerabilities. For example, our SAST does not permit remove vulnerabilities one by one. We cannot remove SSRF and in a given file,
какой-то файл. Соответственно,
some C#
дополнительную
file.
проверку и
So we make additional check and we exclude some vulnerabilities.
На скриншоте вы можете увидеть пример
On this screenshot, you can see an example of adding security champions
в обязательно утверждающих pull request.
in mandatory approving pull requests. So additional commands can be added.
Ну, соответственно, это получается, что мы можем для каждых отдельных
So it happens that for every separate branch or repositories, this can be done. Okay, we'll look at the process of processing vulnerabilities which were discovered in our statistical analysis.
На скриншоте вы можете увидеть пример
On
блокировки.
this screenshot, you can see an example of blocking pull request when validational assembly is not successful due to the reason that we have discovered medium vulnerability and pull request will not be able to complete.
Мы, соответственно, как я говорил ранее, блокируем хотя бы при одной уязвимости.
We are blocking even with one vulnerability of this level, and developer
Кроме как обойти
cannot do anything but just get around all the security guides which are available right now and get an approval from them either to remove the vulnerability or to admit that it is a false positive and then relaunch the validational assembly.
Что команда Ingosstrakh Security Managers, она обязательно.
And Ingosstrakh Security Manager is mandatory.
Кратко рассмотрим примеры уязвимости.
Briefly, we'll look at the vulnerability example.
Это
There are custom headers. These custom headers
соответственно,
is not checked by the function.
эту переменную можно использовать для того, чтобы
And this variable can be checked to redirect user to some vulnerable link.
механика, да?
It doesn't matter how the mechanics works, but the idea is how we reflect information about this vulnerability. We are trying to reflect a lot of useful fields.
Как у меня тут цвета даже не видны.
I don't see the colors,
Уязвимость уровня средний.
but we see that there is a medium level vulnerability, that it's mandatory for its removal. We see all the necessary information for the removal of this vulnerability. So we see at least direct link to the piece of code in the commit.
На результат.
We have a link for the scan result. We have a link for
Нашего
so-called EDE of our SAST.
можем видеть, что в неких
And we can see that some file reports, we add HTML report about the vulnerability that I was speaking about previously, and also there's a direct link to this HTML report if developer is going to be interested in reading it.
полезные
There are blogs, useful blogs, like description of vulnerability, related information, useful information, what is to be done to the developer.
Если вы хотите устранить уязвимость, тегните такую-то команду.
If you want to remove vulnerability, you you have to tag this command or write to this mail, and there are links to questions, to FAQs, frequently asked questions. We keep the history of vulnerability processing in the comments. We see an example of how they are communicating with security people, and we can return to this information. As I've told you previously, we keep the comments, and these comments can be done as mandatory or non-mandatory for permission. So we transfer these comments into some end status, which allows us to put in the head of the developer information that before he will remove the vulnerability, it will be reflected by comments, and it works. If the developer knows that this vulnerability is simple to remove, he will remove it. And we have faced the situation that, yes, it doesn't look beautiful, but realistically speaking, it reduces the number of vulnerabilities which come to our sections, and in principle, it goes into the backlog. Assembly artifacts. Previously, I've told you that we keep the file of the report, and that's how it looks at the report. Some viewers say that with this report, one can work, it's understandable, and you don't have to have access to admin or web interface of our SAST to learn about this vulnerability. Validational builds will not launch themselves. No checks will appear by themselves if we are not going to appoint them. We appoint them by the Azure DevOps policy. An example of how we do it, well, there are two validation assemblies, one for search of secrets, the second one for search of vulnerabilities, the classical SAST, and we definitely do our policies without changes for the developers, unchangeable for the developers, and for every project member, whoever it is, they cannot change our validational assemblies. And we can note that I've selected all these validational assemblies as mandatory ones. Honestly speaking, we managing their mandatoriness by config files. There are situations where our statistical code analysis stops working the way we want it to work, because that's what happens. Our server has been broken. We has allowed certain mistake in our script of processing of the report or in any other script which is being executed, SAST, and the processing of the result of certain checks. So what do we do for the developer? We show this in the green color. In other words, the left screenshot shows that developer, honestly speaking, sees that everything is all right, as if statistical test has passed successfully, it's green. But honestly speaking, if you do validational assembly, we are checking this with orange color, and in a given case, we see that assembly was omitted because SAST was transferred in a service mode due to a certain reason.
Что же такое режим обслуживания? Режим обслуживания...
What is the service mode? Service mode is a mechanism of disconnection of statistical checks without the need of checking the policies.
Переключается достаточно просто. Это maintains...
Which can be switched easily. Maintains mode parameters are transferred between true and false values, and because the first line, the first step of the validational assembly, which was available many slides behind, which allows us to manage the parsing of all the validational steps. With the need, we can pause all our scans, put them objectives in the queue, and it's going to be executed until the moment, while we are not going to switch our SAST, and we'll put this mode from maintenance mode to true false.
Мы рассмотрим, как выглядит пропуск.
We are going to look at how the omitting of the steps looks in our validational assembly. An example of the secret search, we see that the servicing mode is put in true. So all the steps are omitted, and for the developer, everything looks green. What is to be done if you have thousands of repositories, if you have tens of thousands of conveyors. How will you manage all of these? Well, we've been looking at two paths: purchasing expensive, very expensive commercial solution, or we put our scripts into the costs. And these scripts will do it for you. In order to launch some validational assembly, we need to have a conveyor. To have a conveyor, you have to have a file which describes this conveyor. So that all repositories to have this conveyor, well, this has to be done automatically. So as you can see on the screenshot, there's an example of automation of config files addition.
Так выглядит pull request.
That's how pull request looks like. Adding of this file, we go through the pull request so the developers will have a possibility to ask questions, ask, and in such a way, pipeline YAML, which describes from which template we can launch our conveyor. Distribute files, it was a small problem. We have to generate big number of conveyors for every repository so that every conveyor would be launched separately. Why don't we do a single conveyor for launching all validational assemblies? Because if we're going to have one single conveyor, in order for us to understand in which specific launch of this conveyor, which vulnerability was available, we will have to go through a very long UI, and the filtration in this UI will not allow us to find it. So it's much simpler for us, for every repository, have a separate build, and by looking in a specific build, we'll be able to see history of changing the list of vulnerability in this repository, and which errors were in every specific launch. Then we see the policies correction step. This step allows us to add policies which were launching this validational build.
По результату исправления политик мы видим...
Upon the results of policy changes, checks, and amendments, we'll see violations that will help us to understand how successfully we have added our validation conveyors into all repositories.
Поиск секретов.
Secret search.
Поиска секретов.
Secret search process is very simple.
Мы видим какую-то...
We'll make an example. We can see a certain session variable. If the session was stolen from us, then some data can be stolen from us through this session. An example of a comment that this secret was discovered, it's compact. We give to the developer some unneeded information, raw log. We remove extra fields. We add useful information, useful secret URL with a link to that piece of code in that commit where the secret was discovered. Well, the secrets are searched in the whole commit history of all the branches. Also, we see the process of processing this vulnerability that was discovered where developer says that he removed all the secrets from the history. Of course, we search for secrets not only in the code, we search for them in conveyors because developers who can automate assembly and delivery of application, they can leave secrets in an open way. And this can also be done by DevOps engineers. I'm not going to accentuate this topic, but the idea is that you're taking conveyor. If it's graphical, you transfer it into YAML, then send Git leaks, and upon results, you do the same tasks, but without
Нет никакого pull request, мы просто получаем этот отчет.
Pull request, you just get this report, and then we send it into the backlog for the removal of this task.
Что не стоит сканировать? На самом деле,
What shouldn't be scanned?
как мы выяснили, не нужно сканировать.
SAST
Бывает
shouldn't scan everything. There are some things
много каких-то
when there's a lot of different changes that might happen, and we don't need them.
Например,
And they don't have to be scanned. For example,
сервис, как Renovate Bot, он
There is a small service, Renovate Bot. It updates dependencies. We use it to update our internal libraries, not only the external ones.
для того, чтобы
And if developers will launch it to update the whole project from 100 repositories, this Renovate Bot, it will create 100 pull requests, and this will create 100 validation assemblies. Therefore, we will have a big queue of SAST and developers that will have a desire to put changes somewhere. They will not be able to wait for validation assembly because they will execute unneeded statical checks of pull requests from Renovate Bot. It's a good service, however, it can be excluded. On this screenshot, you can see an example of how do we put understandable error of why this
это изменение не было просканировано.
Change was not scanned.
Нам опять же не приходило почему.
So that developer wouldn't come to us with the question, why did it happen?
В своей работе приходится писать кастомные правила.
In my work, in your work, you have to write custom rules for the code, and developers of different applications for the statical code analysis, they deliver these rules with a small amount of files. As we discovered, for example, our statical analyzer of code does not discover dependencies. In a given case, this is JavaScript, where developers of these dependencies decided not to use them, or they decided to uplift the version up to the necessary one, like vulnerabilities that can be checked as potential ones. In case if in a feedback of the developer there's an information that this feedback due to the reason of availability of security threats in the current version, we increase the level of this rule and we can block pull requests. Of course, it's going to be much more difficult for the developers. Conveyor substitution. Previous speaker on several occasions were telling us that developer during the first day can put in the prod, can break something by error, or can do an erroneous step. So we discover substitution of our own conveyors, but in order for the developers not to make our validational assemblies green. So the developer can do it in such a way so that some fake conveyor can be launched, which tells us that everything's okay. And honestly speaking,
no
check is being conducted because of it, because everybody see that everything is as if good for the developer. A couple of rules for secret search. Application which has been delivered doesn't even cover basic cases sometimes. Basic authentication in an open way is not disclosed in the code somewhere. We created a rule. We had to work with big number of exceptions. Also, we have discovered that Git leaks that we've been using does not find password in XML, which was very strange. So we've created a rule. And now we know how to discover them. Please share the rules of the community. If there are 100 companies will make an input in this open source, then we'll be able to receive 100 rules, and then everybody will be able to use this rule. And I've made a couple of examples from myself where we discover some basic things. And we are also discovering the project where FAQs, I'm not going to say it as a word, it sounds pretty bad. But what is to be done if the developer comes to you, asks a question, and you have no time to answer it? Or how can you reduce the number of these questions? Of course, you should have these FAQs somewhere where the developer can ask it to himself when he sees some trigger in a pull request, or if he sees some error in a pull request because validation assembly is being dropped for some reason. We are trying to write very brief, detailed answers to questions like this with links to the addresses, mail addresses. We don't use phrases, please go to the security guys, please go somewhere else. We are writing specifically, go there, do this, or tag this command of security teams, or write to these.
В своем опыте мы попытались использовать DefectDojo.
In our test, we tried the DefectDojo, and it didn't work out. Our intention was as follows. When statistical code analysis was required, we would send the defects to DefectDojo. Some duplicates were eliminated, some other job was done, and we expected the output to be returned to the validation build for us to be able to block the vulnerabilities based on the number of returned vulnerabilities rather than other initial lists. This was our intended process. The advantage of this approach is that we can process all the vulnerabilities centrally in a single place.
Мы можем принимать фалзы в DefectDojo, например,
we can accept
в нашем правиле.
In DefectDojo, the fails, should there be an error,
найденные сработки в исключение.
We can introduce exceptions, throw exceptions,
Точнее, мы уже
parse the errors,
когда будет свободное время.
although we intended to investigate the errors later. The disadvantages included the duplication. Most of the functionality of DefectDojo was not required. We were expected to press key combinations, work with the mouse, so the interface proved to be useless.
Валидационная сборка. Мы видим 3 добавленных шага.
This is our validation build. We have 3 additional steps. Once we've found the secrets, we do some pre-flight tests, checks, to understand where the matches are. As we can see, at the decision-making stage of the 42 identified secrets, 21 were duplicates, and the blocking was only triggered for 21 secrets. That's basically everything.
Что мы рассмотрели, чтобы вы могли...
Once again, what we have discussed so far, so that you could ask your questions. If you need more information, if you wish to read our blog or contact me, please feel free to use this QR code. Thank you.
Честно.
Please evaluate my presentation. And honestly, thank you very much, Sergey, for your presentation. We have questions, and Elena is going to read them. What were the criteria for your quality gate setting up?
На самом деле, я даже не знаю, какие критерии.
Well, hard to say.
Мы можем менять параметр так, как хотим.
If necessary, we can change the parameters as needed. But the only criterion seems to be blocking it. If it's impossible, because we're being rushed by the business, or it may be some code
утверждать, либо мы не хотим
that we would hate to approve,
это такие.
or for some reason we don't want to block it, these may be our criteria.
Блокируем pull request, например, мы идем по пути блокировки.
Pull request blocking criteria may be as follows. If there is at least just one vulnerability,
например,
our peers say
that суммарное какое-то там среднее.
Thresholds can be set such as 3 vulnerabilities and so forth. We can set up the minimal and the maximal level. Let me remind you, all the questions should be asked through our Telegram bot. How do you confirm or decline the identified vulnerability? We need proof. If we can prove that it's a vulnerability, we don't reject it.
То есть, если возможно проэксплуатировать эту уязвимость, либо мы
If it can be exploited,
уязвимость может
or if we understand that the vulnerability,
проэксплуатирована злоумышленником, и не нужно ее
that there is high probability that it will be exploited by a malefactor, and it shouldn't be transferred to the production server, we don't do that. Our purpose is to show that we're tough. We block pull requests.
мы уменьшаем количество уязвимостей.
And in this way, we minimize the number of vulnerabilities.
Как ведется ретроспектива выявленных подтвержденных уязвимостей?
How do you do the retrospective of your identified vulnerabilities? It's not done by myself. It's done by our application security engineers who interact with the teams.
Поиск какой-то информации о том, как эту уязвимость можно ли
They look for information as if there is any possibility to exploit the vulnerability.
какие у вас методологии разработки, все может быть по-разному.
It can vary from one methodology
Мы
to another. We always prioritize.
жестко требовать устраняйте, все устраняйте.
We don't require
На самом деле выбирать
fixing everything. We allow
в первую очередь либо выпускать
the business to prioritize what they want to do first,
вот.
either launching with vulnerabilities or not.
Уже скомпрометирован. Всегда можно увидеть в старом коммите.
The code is in Git. It has already been compromised. It's been committed. What do you do with such vulnerabilities? Do you delete them from Git?
Инструкция о том, как защищать секреты,
We have a hefty instruction
какими-то подсказками.
on protecting our secrets
Мы
with tips.
pull request,
Yes, we block the pull request.
ссылка на эту
The developer
часто
is open the instruction, which is available
одном.
in our frequently asked questions.
Да, мы
In one of our wikis, yes, we erase those secrets, we delete them, we make our people do it.
и
Sometimes it's necessary to complete a pull request, and the secret
при помощи наших конфигов можем
is not expected to be erased right now. We can exclude such a repository
не исключить из-за сканирования, не
from the scanning list,
при этом исключить из
or we may not do it,
реквеста. То есть наш
while it will be
позволяет как полностью отключить
eliminated,
поиск
deleted from
и блокировать по результату поиска.
the pull request file.
Из каких источников формируется набор фидов для композиционного
sources
анализа?
do you use
Правила для проведения
to make up your sets for composite analysis?
Что мы используем?
Would you repeat the last part?
Правила для проведения
Do you use the JAR rule for your composite analysis?
Нет, Яра правила мы не используем.
No, we don't use this rule.
Есть три решения для композиционного анализа.
We have three solutions for composite analysis. As strange as it may sound, one of them is historical. We managed to extend our license
Оно нам позволяет,
a couple of years,
потому что там
and it allows us having
более широкий опыт, чем все наши российские компании.
a stencil, a template.
Оно позволяет нам выявлять больше уязвимостей. У нас есть решение
It allows us to identify more vulnerabilities.
анализатора кода.
We have a solution that's based on our static code analyzer. It works, and we use it. We generate vulnerabilities based on it and block pull
В
requests.
процессе у нас почти что завершено внедрение другого третьего решения от российской компании.
And we're almost done with the introduction of another solution, a domestic solution, which will allow us to do it online.
В процессе просто
We will be able to do it in the process of making builds
к себе на рабочую станцию.
rather than at the stage of pull requests.
У нас.
Как, по каким критериям выбираете проекты и ветки, для которых сканирование
Based on what criteria do you select projects for which scanning is done in the blocking mode?
Все блокируется, то есть у нас по умолчанию
By default, everything is blocked.
все. Если мы хотим внести
We block everything by default. If we need exceptions, we create a separate config file. If there is no such config,
на самом
the blocking is done. Well, basically,
придерживаться максимальной блокировки для тех,
we try
которые у нас торчат в интернет, которые у нас
to do blocking
уровень
for
доверия,
those services that are available in the web
такие какие-то
that require
продукты. Ну, я
increased trust.
я меряюсь
Oh,
репозиториями
well, I'm in no position to speak about products.
какие-то такие.
I deal with conveyors, but the criteria are approximately like this. What do you do with false positive?
Срабатываниями. Ну, если мы говорим про статический анализ кода, мы с ним
If we're talking about the static code analysis, we counter them,
у нас
we parse them,
очень много ложноположительных срабатываний.
we see a lot of false positives
Даже
in Git leaks
переписали так, что они нам находят.
because we reviewed our custom rules in a way that they can identify more secrets, and therefore they generate more exceptions. I mentioned
Управление исключением.
DefectDojo
Сейчас
that was expected to manage
в итоге
exceptions,
управляем исключениями.
but as a result, we manage the exceptions
То есть у нас всегда есть
online.
которые можно обратить.
We always have security people
Работают ложноположительное срабатывание прямо сейчас.
who can be consulted and asked to process false positive right now.
И задержка на валидацию уязвимости со стороны OPSEC-инженера.
Конечно, это хороший вопрос.
Are your OPSEC engineers involved in this process? Yes, good question.
К тому, чтобы этого и не было, вот теми
Although we are working towards getting rid of it,
вот для того, чтобы
the tests that I demonstrated, the cases that I demonstrated,
обратную связь
confirm it in order to minimize it.
просто сказать,
We encourage
рассказываем, как это
thorough
сделать,
feedback.
даем ссылки
We explain how it should be done.
наши,
We provide links
на наши часто задаваемые вопросы.
to our frequently asked questions section.
Азура — это хорошо, но что будете делать в случае...
Azure is good.
Расскажите,
What are you going to do
как выбирали
in
продукт?
case of blocking? Based on what criteria
Azure DevOps,
did you select the product?
вот.
Azure DevOps
Не могу ответить.
came before me, so I'm in no position to answer this question.
Импортозамещать? Нет, вопрос такой не стоит,
If we're going to substitute it,
который позволяет
no. In our opinion, it's product number one,
управлять
allowing to manage the tasks and the source code and the builds and the delivery centrally.
как-то так. То есть это продукт, который, по нашему мнению, мы не заменим.
In our opinion,
Он у нас
it's a product that cannot be replaced in the near term. We have it in the on-premise version.
Секретов на разных этапах.
Do you use
Например, поиск в истории GitLab или
scaling list, for example,
если это технически реализуемо.
the search across GitLab?
Left, суть какая? Мы
Well, I think it's about the shift left. We tried to introduce the
сложно, разработчики не
hooking practice, but the developers proved to be not to be interested.
проходить этап того, что
They don't want
делать, где-то брать конфиг.
to have the stage
Были бы
of changing something, of having to get
не уговорить.
the config file somewhere. We failed to convince our developers. Therefore, our focus today is on working with pull requests. Speaking about the statistic code analysis, the situation here is even worse. The stat that we use
Администратора для установки
requires admins' rights to install plugins in the VDE.
времени
It requires
требует скачать.
a lot of time. It requires downloading gigabytes of data, so we don't rely on this option.
Разработчики
According to the instruction,
без какой-то инструкции пройти этот шаг.
the developers need an instruction
И доставки,
to pass this step. Speaking about the stages of building and delivering,
это сканирование, наверное, уже собранных билдов. Вот, но
all we have is scanning
поиск
ready builds
самих
and search for vulnerabilities
секретов в открытом виде.
in conveyors, namely looking for open secrets in conveyors valuables. What's your time to market?
Вручную.
if most of your code is approved manually.
Одобряется вручную. У нас
Our entire code is reviewed and approved manually.
безопасником, потому что
Not all the code
очень сложно.
is reviewed by
Это очень больно, это очень дорого.
data security personnel because it's really painful and it's expensive. It's difficult to find such experts on the market.
Мне кажется, не имеет отношения.
And the question of time to market appears to be pretty irrelevant in this sense.
Нашим представителям IT, то есть каким-то вторым разработчикам, там, не знаю, архитекторам, тимлидом, выполняется дольше, чем выполняется наша статическая.
It takes
находит наш
our
статический анализ.
development team leads require more time to review the code than our statistical analysis.
В разных форматах.
Different analyzers yield their results in different formats. How do you cope with it?
В разных форматах? Не понял вопрос.
I don't understand your question.
С тем, что разные анализаторы
Different analyzers
в разных форматах.
yield results in different formats. How do you cope with that?
То есть, ну,
We code
какой формат
and code and code, regardless of the analyzer's format. We process it,
красиво, понятно.
get rid of all those unnecessary things, and only keep what we need.
Не было ли
Possibly the question was about that.
легковесный аналог DefectDojo по опыту?
Didn't you have?
Работать?
Это самый крутой вопрос.
Didn't you want to come up with your alternative to DefectDojo? Yes, there were such ideas,
В нашей компании
although at this point we don't have resources to achieve that.
или нанять подрядчика, чтобы
We don't have resources
в который можно было бы
to do it in-house
условно кликнуть
or to outsource it,
уязвимость и
to
автоматически
come up
следующий. То есть
with a product capable of either accepting or declining a vulnerability in one click.